Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, August 4th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. and Ukraine begin talks on security guarantees. So Ukrainian officials said on Thursday that the U.S. and Ukraine have started talks on security guarantees for Ukraine. And this is part of a plan for Washington to provide long-term military support for Kiev. So the U.S. and other G7 nations vowed at the recent NATO summit in Vilnius to negotiate their own bilateral security deals with Ukraine. So this is Andriy Yermak. He is Zelensky's chief of staff. He wrote on Telegram, quote, "It is symbolic that the United States, our biggest strategic partner, became the first country with which Ukraine has started this process. Through this process, we will create a successful model for other partners," end quote. He added that the security guarantees, quote, "will strengthen Ukraine along the path to future membership of the Euro-Atlantic community, including NATO and the European Union," end quote. So the idea here is to give Ukraine some sort of guarantee, some sort of commitment until they can become a NATO member, which who knows when that's going to happen. We have no idea. It might never happen. I think there's a good chance it won't happen. But anyway, Yermak did not say where the talks are taking place or who is involved. According to Reuters, a photo accompanying his Telegram post showed him sitting at a table that appeared to be in the Ukrainian presidential office in Kiev. So we don't know what U.S. officials are over there. I would guess maybe some in the National Security Council or something in the Pentagon, something like that. So while Ukraine walked away from the Vilnius summit without a clear roadmap on when it will join NATO, the U.S. and its allies still made clear that they want to keep funding the proxy war against Russia. Long-term commitments from Western countries will prolong the conflict, as one of Russia's main motives for invading was Ukraine's alignment with NATO, and time is on Russia's side in this war. So this is really just about the U.S. and, these G7 countries really digging in when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And, security guarantees is not going to mean some sort of mutual defense guarantee like NATO provides, because that would put the U.S. at war with Russia, immediately. So I would expect to see, a few-year deal, military aid deal, and Biden has publicly floated the Israel model. So there's a lot of aspects to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but what it really means is, a multi-year deal on military aid. When it comes to Israel, there's a 10-year memorandum of understanding, and under that, they get $3.8 billion in aid, military aid each year from the U.S. So I wouldn't expect to see a 10-year deal with Ukraine, but maybe like a 4-year or something like that we might see. So we'll see how it all plays out. All right, the next one here, Russia's economy projected to grow despite Western sanctions. So the International Monetary Fund has said it expects the Russian economy to grow by 1.5% this year, despite the U.S.-led Western sanctions campaign against the country, which President Biden once vowed would turn the ruble into rubble. So the Russian economy shrank by 2.1% last year, but it has bounced back as Russia is adjusting to the sanctions. The Wall Street Journal on Wednesday called the economic war a stalemate, comparing it to the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine. So the report said that the sanctions initially made it harder for Russia to acquire microchips and other technical components, but Moscow then found sanctions loopholes through neighboring countries. Russia has also had no problems selling its oil, as it's found new markets in India and elsewhere in Asia. The journal cited analysts who said the sanctions will hurt Russia in the long term. They're saying, no, we'll just wait and see how this is going to hurt Russia. But Russia continues to forge stronger ties and significantly increase trade with China. That's a big deal. And, they're increasing trade at a pretty rapid rate. And an alternative to the U.S.-dominated global financial system is slowly being formed by Russia, China, and other countries targeted with U.S. sanctions. the U.S. has successfully, in the past, U.S. sanctions have really ruined economies of smaller countries. Not, this is the first time that they tried to do this to a country with an economy the size of Russia's. And U.S. sanctions on smaller nations are actually starting to lose some of their power because China and Russia are offering alternative markets. One example is that Iranian oil sales in 2022 exceeded those in 2016. And that was before the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions on the country. So that was the whole deal with the Iranian nuclear deal. The U.S. eased sanctions. They didn't lift all of them. And then Trump came in and pulled out of that and put the sanctions back on. But because of oil sales to China, Iranian oil sales have really increased. And that's why the U.S. has relied on, desperate measures like seizing oil tankers and stealing the cargo off of them, or at least trying to. We'll get more into that in another story. But, again, these sanctions are still hurting ordinary people. And even in Russia, the economic shock that was felt from the initial sanctions, that wasn't felt by Putin and his, inner circle. That was felt by, regular Russians who, didn't have anything to do with planning this war. All right, so the next one, I just left up the one from yesterday about how there's no breakthroughs, on the battlefield in Ukraine. The next one here, Poland says that Wagner in Belarus is destabilizing NATO, or plans to destabilize NATO. So Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki claimed on Thursday that Wagner fighters were deployed to Belarus in an attempt to destabilize bordering NATO countries, which the alliance refers to as its eastern flank. So Morawiecki called the Russian mercenary force extremely dangerous and said that it had been redeployed to NATO's eastern flank to destabilize it. He estimated that there could be more than 4,000 Wagner members in Belarus. He made the comments with Lithuania's president, and they were meeting at the Suwalki Gap, which is a strip of land on the Polish-Lithuanian border that stretches from Belarus to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. The two leaders met to discuss the threat that they believe Wagner poses to the region. So if you're watching here and you see the map, you have Poland and Lithuania's border. That's highlighted in orange, and that land connects Belarus to Kaliningrad, which is on the Baltic Sea and sandwiched in between two NATO members. And, Kaliningrad is Russian. It's not, territory. It's an oblast. It's a state. It's like Alaska is to the United States. And this was always a big argument against expanding NATO so far because, now Kaliningrad for a while now has been surrounded by NATO territory. And this was something Lithuania tried to cut off, transport to Kaliningrad, tried to basically put an economic embargo on that territory, but under pressure from big, I know Germany pressured them to lift it because that's a serious, provocation to Russia, and something Lithuania, a small country like Lithuania, would never do if they weren't a NATO member. So this is the problem with giving all these war guarantees to these small countries, right on Russia's border or near Russia's border. Well, this is, again, Kaliningrad, so they do border Russia. So Morawiecki said, quote, "Today, the borders of Poland and Lithuania are the borders of the free world that stops the pressure from the despotism from the East," end quote. So pretty dramatic rhetoric there. He warned that Wagner could carry out sabotage actions, and he thanked Lithuania for, quote, "military cooperation and for the joint promise that we will defend every piece of land of NATO countries," end quote. So Poland has been beefing up its border with Belarus since Wagner fighters went there as part of a deal to end Yevgeny Prigozhin's short-lived mutiny against the Russian military establishment. Tensions escalated on Tuesday when Poland accused Belarus of violating its airspace with military helicopters. That's an accusation that Minsk has denied. So separately on Thursday, Poland's defense minister said that Poland was responding to what they call these provocations from Wagner by increasing the size of the Polish army on the eastern border of the country by redeploying troops from the west. So tensions are really high in this area, and it's definitely concerning because you never know, what could happen. And again, Poland is very, They have their issues with Ukraine, actually. They've been feuding over, World War II era massacres of Poles that were carried out by Ukrainian nationalists, but they're all in on, a proxy war against Russia, and you just never know what could happen over there in that part of Europe. All right, the next one here, the UK says that it intercepted 50 Russian planes over Estonia in 4 months. So the Times of London reported Thursday that the British Royal Air Force intercepted 50 Russian planes over Estonia in the past 4 months, while it led NATO's air policing mission on Russia's border. So the skies in the Baltic region of Europe have become a potential flashpoint for a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, as their aircraft have had frequent encounters, demonstrating the risks of NATO expansion up to the Russian border. British officials said that there's been a significant increase in Russian military flights in the area since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. British Defense Minister Ben Wallace said, quote, "Hundreds of RAF pilots and personnel have spent months away from their families working around the clock alongside our allies to keep Europe's skies safe," end quote. So the British Royal Air Force had been leading this NATO mission since March, and now it handed it off to the Spanish Air Force. So if you're watching here, you see this map of Estonia, and this is the area that borders Russia, and there's also this big lake that has part of the border. And I know that I think a lot of these intercepts happen over this lake. I'm not sure, I can't say how many out of this 50, but I know I've just seen reports. A lot of them happen there. And, when it comes to, someone mentioned to me recently that they don't know what it means for a plane to intercept another plane, like what exactly that means. And I know that the U.S. government definition of it is a plane comes up on the pilot side doing the same, on the same heading and speed, but there's other definitions. It could just mean a plane meeting another plane in some way, and then, trying the goal is to turn them back. So again, this is another potential flashpoint, and talking about NATO expansion and how dangerous this just whole situation is, especially when the alliance is funding this proxy war against Russia and their planes are encountering each other so frequently. And another potential flashpoint is in the Black Sea, where U.S. and NATO aircraft frequently fly reconnaissance. In March, a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone was downed after an encounter with Russian fighter jets. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently announced that the alliance plans to increase air patrols in the Black Sea. So there's also been these close encounters between U.S. and Russian aircraft over Syria, with both sides accusing the other of aggressive action. U.S. officials claimed last week that two U.S. drones were struck with flares that were dropped by Russian jets in separate incidents. So all these potential flashpoints, and this is just Russia we're talking about, Russia and NATO and the U.S. And things can happen very quick. All right, the next one here. The U.S. might put troops on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. So this is, according to a report from the Wall Street Journal, it said that the U.S. military might place armed troops on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and the idea would be to protect commercial vessels from being seized by Iran. But this will really ramp up tensions if they do this, and it could result in direct clashes between the U.S. and Iranian militaries. There's a lot of questions about this. Are they just going to be, it looks like it's Marines that they're thinking about doing, or Navy sailors. So is it just going to be a few dozen Marines on a ship, and then if Iranian boats come up, what are they going to do? Fire on them to prevent them from seizing it? And then what happens then? It's just seems so dangerous. And the U.S. has been steadily increasing its military presence in the Persian Gulf since Iran seized 2 tankers earlier this year, and that was provoked by the U.S. seizing a tanker carrying Iranian oil. So this is very important context that's not included in these other articles, mainstream media write-ups of this story. Using the pretext of sanctions enforcement, the U.S. Justice Department seized the Greek tanker Suez Rajan in April and forced the ship to head for Texas instead of China, as the U.S. intended to steal the 800,000 barrels of Iranian oil that it was carrying. But according to recent media reports, U.S. companies are hesitant to discharge the oil because they fear the reprisals from Iran in the Persian Gulf. And the Suez Rajan is stuck off the coast of Texas, and Iran warned American companies, don't discharge that oil or, or else. So, Iran has seized tankers before, but these current tensions started with the U.S. seizing this ship, and then Iran seized 2 tankers after that. So, that's just the reality. And since then, the U.S. provoked this tension, and now they're just started this military buildup in the Persian Gulf. So, U.S. officials speaking to AP said that no final decision has been made on placing armed troops on commercial vessels. They said discussions have been ongoing between the U.S. and Gulf Arab states, and the potential plan would involve U.S. Marines or Navy sailors providing the security. The U.S. recently announced the deployment of an amphibious readiness group Marine Expeditionary Unit to the region, which typically consists of about 2,200 Marines and 3 amphibious warships. So placing armed American troops on commercial vessels in the region would be a completely unprecedented action. According to AP, the U.S. did not even take this step during the tanker war, which was part of the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. So the tanker war led to a one-day major naval battle between the U.S. and Iran in 1988, and it resulted in the sinking of most of the Iranian Navy. A lot of people don't know about, the U.S. was backing Saddam Hussein in this 8-year war against Iran when he used chemical weapons, brutal war, trench warfare. I believe the casualties are something like 1 million people. And then just a couple years after that, they turned on Saddam and he was the big enemy. It's really something. But the biggest tragedy that came out of this, tanker war and the tensions there was in a few months after the big battle. Tensions were still high in the region, and a U.S. Navy vessel shot down a civilian airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 people on board. A similar tragedy happened in 2020 when tensions were again soaring in the region following the U.S. assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani via a drone strike in Baghdad. Iran shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, which took off from Tehran, killing all 176 people on board. And, that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Trump drone bombing Soleimani. So if you look at the series of events, obviously a lot happened before the Soleimani thing, but the U.S. drone striked him. And then I believe it was January 6th, or no, I'm not going to give dates because I don't have them in front of me, but it was early January. The U.S. killed Soleimani. Iran fired some missiles at an American base. They told Iraq they were doing it, so the U.S. probably had a heads up. And then it was right after that Iran downed this airliner. They said they did it unintentionally. But you see what happens when tensions are high in the region, when the U.S. and Iran are in conflict. Very, very bad things can happen. That's why it's just so reckless to be doing something like this when it's just not necessary. This is all just over a spat over the U.S., sanctions and trying to force Iran to not sell its own oil. All right, so the next one here, Biden calls for the release of Niger's president. So President Biden on Thursday called for the immediate release of Niger's president, Mohamed Bazoum, who's been detained since being ousted by a military coup last week. Biden said in a statement commemorating Niger's Independence Day, quote, "I call for President Bazoum and his family to be immediately released and for the preservation of Niger's hard-earned democracy," end quote. So Thursday marked the 63rd anniversary of Niger's formal independence from France. So the U.S. has backed threats from a bloc of West African nations, the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS. And the U.S. has backed their threats to use force if Bazoum is not reinstated by this Sunday. So that's their deadline. So it's coming up soon. And the U.S. would probably be involved. There's about 1,100 U.S. troops. There's 1,500 French troops in Niger. So it's just, this could really turn into something. So the Niger junta is standing firm in the face of pressure and sanctions from other West African nations, which has involved Nigeria cutting off power to Niger. And from what I've read, Nigeria provides Niger with about 70% of its electricity. So that means millions of people in Niger are without power. And Niger's coup leader called the sanctions inhumane and said that the military will not cave to the pressure. So they're not backing down. ECOWAS is saying that they want to use military action as a last resort, but saying that they're preparing for the eventuality. So it sounds like they're serious about it. Burkina Faso and Mali say that if ECOWAS intervenes in Niger, it's going to be the equivalent of declaring war on them. So that means this could turn into a big regional war that the U.S. would be involved in. So this could really turn into a big mess here. So, see, really try to keep an eye on it. All right, so the next one here, this is an article from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. BAE Systems reaps huge windfall amid global tensions. And this is the British arms maker. So amid the surge in NATO members' military spending as a result of the war in Ukraine, BAE Systems announced that during the first half of the year, its net profits soared with a 57% increase. It's huge. The British arms industry giant reported its huge windfall on Wednesday. BAE Systems stated its revenue swelled to £11 billion, an increase of 13%, while profits after taxes increased to £965 million during the first 6 months of 2023, and that's compared with £615 million in the same period last year. I bet the profits that Raytheon and Lockheed Martin make, are much larger, but still, these are huge amounts of money, of course. And Chief Executive Charles Woodburn declared, quote, "Our global footprint and leading technologies enable us to effectively support the national security requirements and multi-domain ambitions of our government customers in an increasingly uncertain world. I'm particularly proud of our support to Ukraine. We've delivered an excellent set of results," end quote. I don't know what is excellent about anything that's happening in Ukraine when you look at how the Ukrainian forces are struggling and being killed. But, it's a big boon for the arms makers, which, of course, is not a surprise. But that is it for the news for today. So Sunday marks the anniversary, August 6th, of the U.S. nuclear bombing of Hiroshima, the Japanese city. So we have a big page with lots of stories on that, and a few of them are our viewpoints. We have one from Norman Solomon. Decades later, the U.S. government called Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear tests. So this is really interesting. So he says in 1980, when he asked the press office at the U.S. Department of Energy to send a listing of nuclear bomb test explosions, the agency mailed me an official booklet with the title Announced United States Nuclear Tests, July 1945 through December 1979. So the Trinity test in New Mexico was on the top of the list, and second was Hiroshima, and third was Nagasaki. So they listed them as tests, which is really something. And then he said that later on, the classification changed, apparently in an effort to avert a PR problem. So by 1994, a new edition of the same document explained that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not tests, in the sense that they were conducted to prove that the weapon would work as designed. So it's just really something how they put it. And our spotlight is also about the bombing, and it is from Brian McGlinchey at his Substack. Hiroshima, Nagasaki bombs were needless, says World War II's U.S. military leaders. So, and this is just really important, is that, a lot of people get really mad at me on the internet when I say that the U.S. did not need to nuke, hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. And, the fact of the matter is that, U.S. military officials, top U.S. military officials at the time said it was unnecessary to get Japan to surrender. And McGlinchey has a few of them listed here, including General Dwight Eisenhower, Admiral William Leahy, who was Truman's chief of staff, Major General Curtis LeMay, 21st Bomber Command, General Hap Arnold, U.S. Army Air Forces, Ralph Byrd, Under Secretary of the Navy, Brigadier General Carter Clark, a military intelligence officer, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Pacific Fleet Commander. So big, high, top brass said we did not have to nuke Japan. So it's just very, very important, especially with Oppenheimer. You know, I feel like there's more attention on this, so you should really kind of spread this stuff. And then if you scroll down, we have a whole section dedicated to both bombings. And one of them is from Scott Horton that he wrote up a few years ago titled "Who Opposed Nuking Japan?" And he just lists quotes from all sorts of U.S. government officials. It's a pretty big list. And there's also the Strategic Bombing Survey, which I think he put in here. And that was a U.S. government commissioned study of the U.S. bombings, you know, in Europe and in Japan. And I believe they issued this in 1946. But again, U.S. commissioned study. And that study concluded that even without the nuclear bombings and without the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan, they believed that Japan would have surrendered before the end of the year in 1945, and likely before November 31st, 1945. And this is August 6th, 1945, that they dropped the first bomb. So again, U.S. Commission study at the time, they went to Japan, they interviewed people, they interviewed Japanese leaders, and that's what they concluded. So, you know, we were taught in school, I was taught in school at least, that it was either nuke all these civilians, vaporize all these civilians, or invade, and then millions would die. But the invasion wasn't necessary. But I feel like that false dichotomy that we're taught as kids in the U.S. is such like a foundational thing for our, you know, propaganda, just the way that they propagandize us. You know, they taught us that they had to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians to save lives. It's very powerful propaganda. And the reaction that people have when you say that we didn't have to nuke Japan is just very revealing, I think, of the way the propaganda works. So go check all that stuff out. And also, if you go to our blog, we've been reprinting some really great articles from Greg Mitchell, who's written a lot about Oppenheimer and the nuclear bomb, and just some blog entries like about just fascinating things that a lot of people don't know about. And you could also just go check out his Substack, Oppenheimer from Hiroshima to Hollywood. So, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there. And then back to the other viewpoints that we have. One from Jacob Hornberger, Uncle Sam, Nuclear Polluter. That's over at the Future Freedom Foundation. And we have one from Robert Crawford, How the Media Makes Impact of U.S. Forever Wars Invisible. That's at Responsible Statecraft. One from Brandon Warner, Fans of Cluster Bombs Dominate WAPO's Opinion Section. That's over at FAIR. So go check all that stuff out. And also a reminder, my friend Pat McFarland made a documentary called The Real Oppenheimer about how the Manhattan Project scientists were shooting up, injecting Americans with plutonium without their knowledge. And it's called The Truth About Oppenheimer. That's on his YouTube channel, Vital Dissent. He's also a contributor to the Libertarian Institute, so you can find his stuff there. But yeah, go check all that out. That's it for me for the week. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Tell your friends about antiwar.com, about this show. Share it around, comment, and all that good stuff. I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. Thanks for listening.